I feel incredibly honored to have, I really do mean that sincerely. My first meeting with you was actually at CAS Awards, I think a couple of years ago, maybe through Damsky.
Right,
maybe.
and I run into you.
I'm stalking you. No, so, but he won a Career Achievement Award for the Cinema Audio Society, which is an amazing. They don't give it out, very easily at all. It's a really high
it was
honor.
a tremendous honor.
But you could see why. I mean, I was going to go and start saying titles, but really, I think they're kind of self-explanatory at this point, giving our visuals. He's really worked on an amazing diversity of films, not to mention have seen much of technology change and workflow change, and it's a real gift to have him today. So without further ado, Jeff Wexler.
And the thing about the CAS award also was that I was really surprised actually that they would honor me in that way, but they call it the Career Achievement Award rather than the Lifetime Achievement Award because they want to first of all give it to people before their careers are over, and they also take into consideration your contribution to the industry and to the work that we do. Not so much, my resume is a good resume. I've worked on a lot of good movies, and I've worked on some dogs and stuff like that, but. And there are lots of people that have much bigger resumes with much bigger movies. But I think that the people at CAS really felt that I contributed more than just the work that I had done, because it's my other passion actually is teaching. Originally I was going to be a school teacher. I was going to teach sociology at the college level. I had no intention of getting into this business at all. I've been around it all my life. Basically, my father is Haskell Wexler, who's a fairly high-profile cameraman and director. And so I was around the set, probably at the age of 2, riding on the dolly and playing with all the neat toys and all that. And but growing up, I never wanted to get into the movie business at all. It was just not something I even thought about. I wanted to be an architect actually, and my older sister, who was dedicated to making sure I would fail at anything I tried, talked me out of it. She said, "You'll never be an architect. The math will kill you," And I wasn't very good in math or arithmetic. It turns out I was seriously dyslexic, and I really, a column of figures was like the most intimidating thing ever. So she was right to a certain extent, even though she could have said, you will make it as an architect because you can get a draftsman, a draftsperson who will deal with all that stuff, and you can be the creative force, and but she wasn't going to do that. She was just telling me that I would fail. But so I was in college for years and years, heading for my master's in sociology and getting a teaching credential and all that. And I think somewhere along the way, my father suggested that I maybe had been in school a little too long, and he was sort of tired of paying for my education, and suggested that I get a summer job. So the logical place for him to get me work was in the movie business, which is what he had been doing most of his life. And he got me a job on Harold and Maude, working in the art department. So I was hired as a production assistant to work on that film. I already knew Hal Ashby because Hal Ashby was a terrific editor for 20 years before he became a director, and had been the picture editor on a number of movies that my father had shot for Norman Jewison. And I had spent a lot of time going to dailies and sitting in the editing room and experiencing that whole side of it, aside from being on the set and watching Pop shoot and stuff like that. But when I got the job on Harold and Maude, it was the first time that I was on the set as an active participant, not as a guest or a visitor, and I loved it. It was just amazing. I went to dailies every day, and all the stuff that I was doing for the movie was right there on the screen. The next day, I'd go to dailies and I would see, that little thing that I did when they had to. I don't know if you've all seen the movie or if any of you have seen it, but I was working with the production designer and the prop man and it was my job to get all the stuff that that was going to be up on the screen. For example, when Harold's mother gives him the E-Type Jaguar, and we wanted a big red ribbon. Production designer said we want a big red ribbon. I had to go to downtown San Francisco and find the place that manufactures ribbon and could actually cut something that was this wide so it would cover the car and it would look like a gift and all. So it was really exciting. And then you see it up on the screen and it's just great. It's just exactly what it should be. All those daisies that were cut out in the railway car and everything on her birthday and all. I sat there at night cutting out all those daisies and stuff like that. So it was really a terrific experience. And I think probably halfway through the movie, I decided this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to be a teacher. I'm not going to pursue that. I want to work on movies. So I thought that I would continue on in the art department, but I wanted to do something more technical because I'm a real gadget freak and I love playing with all the equipment and everything. So it was either going to be camera or sound, and it was not going to be camera. My father has very large shoes to fill. I didn't want to follow in his footsteps or any of that stuff. So I chose sound. And without really knowing anything about it, except I watched it being done, just as I'd watched camera being shot on the set. I listened to it in the editing room. I sort of had an idea that of how it was to be done, but I just presented myself to the world. First of all, I did try and do a little boom work at first by putting, I think it was some sort of heavy object, maybe it was a book or something, on the end of a broomstick, held it up over my head for about 10 seconds, and I said, this is not for me. If getting into sound means holding the stick over my head, it's not going to work. So I said, well, I'll just tell everyone I'm a sound mixer. I'll just bypass that, working in utility and then becoming a boom operator, and I'll just say, hey, I'm a sound mixer. So I got an interview for some reason, probably because of my father, I don't even know, with Gene Corman, Roger Corman's brother, who was producing a movie. And I went in for an interview to get the job as a sound mixer. And we talked about stuff, and he asked me how Pop's doing, and and all sort of stuff. And he said, he said, I know you've heard a lot of things about my brother Roger. That he does these really, really fast, down and dirty movies, and he says, this film's going to be a little classier. He said, we're actually going to shoot for 3 weeks on this feature film instead of the 2 weeks that Roger. So, I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I got the job, and then I had to start learning what it is to be a sound mixer. So the first suggestion that came up, and there were a lot of people on this job, incidentally, it was their first job also. Andy Davis was a cameraman who hadn't really shot anything substantial before. He went on to be a director, did The Fugitive and Under Siege and a bunch of other big movies. Tak Fujimoto went on to become a great DP. But we were all on this movie, and it was pretty much our first job. The difference was Andy actually had shot some stuff, and Tak Fujimoto had actually been an assistant cameraman on various things, but I had never been a production sound mixer. So Andy suggested that I had to hire a boom operator. It was going to be a 2-person crew, which is pretty much the way those movies were done. They didn't expect you to do it as a 1-person crew. So Andy suggested that I hire an old friend of his from Chicago, who was not a boom operator. He was a teacher. His name was Tom Holman. He taught film at the University of Illinois at Champaign. And I hired Tom based on what Andy had said. And Tom showed up, and what we would do is we just went over the Nagra every day on the job, as a matter of fact. Talk about on-the-job training. I'd say, Tom, so what does that switch do? And he would, in between takes, when he wasn't booming, he would come over and he would explain things to me, and he would explain them to me in great detail because he was a teacher. So when I would go to the filters on the Nagra, low frequency 1 and 2, and all, he would not only tell me what the filter does, but he would give me some tutorial on when is the best use of these filters, and you use this because you want to reduce wind noise, and and all this sort of stuff. So I got a real education, and we got through the picture, and they actually shot for 4 weeks, went over schedule. It was a terrible movie, and the picture was very bad. I mean, the image was bad, the sound was bad. I mean, it was just horrendous. But I think they paid me $450 a week for me and equipment. And we got through it, and I learned a whole lot about how to be a sound mixer. The story, Tom was up an 8-foot ladder, getting ready to boom a scene, 5 people in it. And he was trying to get his cues and remember the dialogue and all the stuff that the boom operator has to do. Right before they're ready to roll the camera, he came down off the ladder, comes over to me, and he says, we're using the AKG CK9, which is, a long shotgun microphone that has an interference tube, and it really wants to be operating in a free field because we're getting lateral reflections off the ceiling, and it's affecting the polar response. And I said, Tom, get up that ladder and point the mic at the people who talk. Because we had a movie to make, and Tom was like lecturing me. So I did learn things about microphones, but we had a movie to make, and so that was my contribution to Tom's learning, because that is the bottom line. Is that the worst production sound mixers are the people that have come out of, and this is my own opinion, the people that have come out of audio engineering or acoustic training or things like that, because a movie set, first of all, we're doing sound for picture. It's very important to remember that we're doing sound for picture. We're not doing sound for its own sake. We're not recording music. And the most important thing is that the sound that we do has to be appropriate and proper for the picture that's being shot. And that is that's the overriding challenge that is getting more and more challenging every day for all of us. But it's the thing that's hardest to learn, that and the relationships on the set, the importance of cooperation, the importance of understanding everyone else's job, also the fundamental understanding that during production, there's a reason why movies, and I'll speak mostly about movies because that's where most of my experience has been, there's a reason why there's the production period and there's the post-production period. It's very similar in the music world where you'll have a tracking session and then a mixing session, where tracking is basically getting all the stuff that's eventually going to create the great album or the great piece of music. What we do in production is getting all of those pieces, getting all of those things. We're not making the whole movie on that day, even though there's a lot of DPs that think they're making the whole movie on that day, and I want to get this beautiful picture right here that they don't realize will not cut at all with this other great picture they're going to make in the afternoon. And for sound mixers, in my career, in the beginning, I realized that the most important thing was not just recording good, clean dialogue, but to record stuff that would actually work, that the rest of the people who are going to make the movie will have the necessary tools to, and will not have their hands tied by allowing just overlapping dialogue at all the time just because the director thinks it feels real today, and feels really awful later, all sorts of things, or trying to control background sounds that come and go depending on the camera angle, depending on where you're shooting, and all these sorts of things, because the thing that an audience notices most, particularly on a soundtrack, are discontinuities and things that don't make sense. And what I mean by that is if something doesn't match our expectations of the reality of whatever it is we're watching, if something takes you out of that, that's what an audience notices more than, let's say, sound that isn't pristine or sound that isn't necessarily perfect. And an example of this, one of the examples would be a big compliment that I actually got from Buzz Knudsen after, who was a chief re-recording mixer at Todd AO for many, many years. He was the mixer on Bound for Glory, which was the first big union movie that I could do. And when I sat in on the dialogue pre-dubs on that, he said, I want to thank you, he says, for making sure that when they do the wide shot, and then they do a 3-shot, and then they do a 2-shot, and they do a single, you didn't always move the microphone as close as it could be. So that when we got into the single, the microphone is still a little back there. We still hear a little bit of the room. He says, stuff cuts like butter. And so I learned from Buzz that it's not, I mean, a lot of people will tell you, and they'll tell their boom operator, a lot of product, get that mic right down there, we're in a close-up now, you can get right down. But the point is, when you cut all that together, all of a sudden that close-up, not only visually, but, on the soundtrack, feels like it's coming from somewhere else. There's 2 areas where I've been pretty much a pioneer, and that is, I was the first to do DAT recording in production for movies when it was not yet a proven format at all. And I was able to do it. First of all, I wanted to do it because it was the first chance we had to record digital audio in the field in a practical manner. I mean, we had done some projects before with, with large-scale, digital recorders and stuff like that, and even some early experiments with the Sony F1 system. I don't know if you know, that was tied to the Betamax, but the DAT machine finally gave us the possibility of recording digital audio in the field, so I wanted to do it. And I knew that it had already been pretty much a proven format in the music world. I mean, they were loving it. It became an immediate substitute for a 2-track, not necessarily for a 2-track master, but at least for a 2-track distribution. And I don't think it was really used in the music world for mastering, except at certain levels. And what we're doing in production sound is we are making the master production recording. So I was a little concerned about that. But I started using a Sony D10. This was even before the D10 Pro, which was really a consumer machine, which was not readily available because during this time, the music industry and the film industry was again trying to get a format outlawed. DAT machines, you weren't allowed to bring a DAT machine into the country. I don't know if you know this or not, because similar to the famous Betamax suit, where the studios tried to outlaw videotape, home videotape, because they felt it was a threat to it turned out to be a huge moneymaker when they started distributing movies on tape for home use. That's a whole different story. But they went after DAT for the same reasons. People can make digital copies, we cannot allow this. So the DAT machine that I actually got was from Japan, and it was a gray market DAT machine with a Japanese manual. But I was hell-bent on using this, and I wasn't going to make any production a guinea pig for this format, so I was still running my Nagra. So I was running a complete parallel system. My mixing panel was feeding the DAT machine and was feeding the Nagra, and so that if there was some big problem with the DAT format, the production wouldn't suffer. They would still have the 1/4 inch as they've always had it. I had the extra advantage that a couple of years before this, or actually several years before this, 1980, this would have been 1989 when I first used the DAT machine. In 1980, Hal Ashby decided that he would hand over North Star Media Sound Services, which was his little post-production company, that it was doing all the sound transfers for the movies that he was doing. And they also had a telecine setup. He didn't want to give me the telecine setup because I was still making them some money. But he said, I want you in charge of the whole sound side of it. So he actually gave me and my boom operator, Don Sufal, the rights to North Star Media if we would run it and keep it profitable and all that. So we owned this little transfer facility where I actually did a lot of sound transfers myself. So I learned how all that's done. When we did the first movie with DAT, we did all the sound transfers at North Star. So the editing department, they didn't know any different. They ended up with the single stripe mag, the way they've always gotten it. We didn't even have to, fortunately the editing department, they actually were interested in the fact that I was using DAT, and they were excited about it and all that sort of stuff. After 2 or 3 movies where we were doing all the transfers, the format had proven itself for the most part for me. You know, I knew it would work. There were no sync issues because being a digital format, it basically was a dead sync, self-syncing format. You know, and this is before we were dealing with timecode or anything else, so that none of those were issues. It certainly was as accurate as Crystal Sync, which is what we've been relying on for years and years. So really the transfers were just pop the DAT cassette in there, press play, and play it out in real time and transfer to mag. So a job came up for, actually it was Jack the Bear, was the picture that I did for Fox. Fox said, well, you know, the transfers will be done here at 20th Century Fox. So I had to tell them, I said, well, I'm recording on DAT. And they said, what's DAT? They then sort of looked into it and they said, well, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do DAT, we don't want to do that. And we really would prefer to have you just record on 1/4 inch, and we don't want this, the production to be a guinea pig for a new format. I said, I've done 4 movies, I know it works. But they were going to do the transfers, and so I went into the transfer room and talked to all the people there, and they just were still stonewalling it. They said, there's no way we're going to do this. And they said, well, you know, it's digital, right? And I said, yeah, it's a digital tape format. They said, well, we're going to have to tell the production company it's going to cost a little bit more to do the transfers. And I said, it's not going to cost you more. I said, first of all, you're going to do the transfers in half the time. I said, you're charging by the foot anyway. You'll be able to do more jobs because I'm doing DAT. I said, if you tell the production company it's going to cost more, I said, that's going to kill the format. And I guarantee you, this is the way you're going to be doing transfers in the near future. I said, I may be the first that's doing it now, and this may be the first job that you're doing, but you better get used to it. You know, they didn't like being dictated to, but they agreed to it. And after the first week, well, first of all, I should back up. They said, well, you know, when we get this DAT, you know, it's a cassette, right? And I said, yeah, it's a little cassette. They said, well, how do we transfer? And I said, well, you get a DAT machine and you pop the cassette in there and you press play and you play it out to your Magnatech. We don't have a DAT machine. And I said, well, 20th Century Fox has a DAT machine. I said, you know, they actually have 10 of them over in the music department, Panasonic 3700s. I said, go over there and ask them if you can borrow one, patch it into your transfer channel, you know, press play, you got it done. So after the first week, I said, we love it. This is great. We don't have to listen to the 1/4 inch. We don't have to listen to your voice slates and all that. We can go right to the index points on your sound log. We're getting it done faster. It's great and all. They said, but you know those index numbers, you know, the sequential numbers and all, could that be seen and take? And I said, no, it can't be seen and take. You've got to look at the sound report to get the seen and take. And they said, well, it'd be so neat if, so I explained to them about the DAT format, that the index point takes 9 seconds to lay down. It was an afterthought when they developed the format. I said, the best you can do is jump ahead to the next index point sequentially. It can't be seen and take. You still have to, you know, look at the sound report and all. They said, oh, well, we're just asking, you know. So they're already hoping for something, you know, something that they refused to use, they're now loving. I got the chance to use the first file-based production recorder with the Diva, the original Diva. So I figure this is fine. I already had problems with DAT. You know, when the professional machines started to come in from Fostex, notably, and various other companies, there were problems. It's not a great format. You know, it's very squirrely. I finally turned my back on Fostex DAT machines when I was working on Clint Eastwood's Perfect World. Now, Clint, as you may know, has very little patience with anything technical. He's very conservative in terms of what, you know, he wouldn't even let Steve St. John use his new Steadicam arm, Steadicam Pro or whatever, because we didn't use it on the last movie. I don't want to take any chances, you know, the whole thing. Well, first of all, I had to get permission from Warner Brothers to do DAT on the movie. Warner Bros. Didn't want to give me permission to do DAT. I said, I'll record on the Nagra as well, which I really didn't want to do because, you know, or I'll record on 2 DAT machines, whatever. In any case, they let me do it. But several days in a row, Clint would say, roll sound. I'd press record on the Fostex, and it would lock up. Just wouldn't run, wouldn't work. I'd have to say, hang on a minute, you know. Well, on like the 3rd time that I had to say this, particularly to somebody like Clint Eastwood, he said, this is no good. You know, I got through the movie. I don't think Clint, he still likes me personally, but he'll never hire me again. I really almost lost my job because this machine was screwed up. So I had massive conversations with Fostex about it. They said, well, I think you were experiencing what we call stack error, which is there were too many commands. I said, there weren't too many commands. I was pressing record. That's the most basic thing this machine has to do. When they say roll sound, I got to hit that button. So I'd had it with Fostex. I went on to the HHB DAT machine, which worked much better. But I never really fell in love with the format. I fell in love with the fact that I could be a pioneer and I could introduce the industry to it and talk to you guys about it and all that sort of stuff. But as soon as the possibility of using the Diva showed up, I was thrilled. I thought, this is going to be amazing. And I stood up at we had a union meeting about multi-track recording in the field and all sort of stuff. And so I attended that meeting. And they were mostly talking about Tascam D88s, and all, which were in pretty big usage in a lot of TV shows and various other things. And I'd used them when we had to do multi-track recording in the field. It's a big beast. It's not something that you want to, certainly not something you're going to wear over your shoulder. Sort of halfway through that meeting, I stood up and I brought my Diva with me, the original Diva 1, and I held it up over my head and I said, I think this is the way we're going to be doing stuff in the very near future. And everyone said, what's that? And I said, it's the Diva. I said, it's a file-based production recorder and 4-track recorder, full time code, records to a hard drive. And everyone said, oh, that's really interesting. And a good friend of mine, Courtney Gooden, who's a long-term production mixer and video person and a total computer maven, said, that'll never work. He said, we can't trust the production sound to this little recorder that's generating sound files and all that. He says, what about confidence monitoring? What about listening off tape? What about, he says, it's never going to work. Well, he was wrong, and he was wrong to this day. But I decided I'm going to use this as I'd used DAT, and I got a job working on Ed Zwick's picture not Under Siege, The Siege. They shot most of the picture in New York, but they were coming out here to do 6 weeks of work. And I told Ed Zwick and the rest of the production that I'm going to be using this new recorder. They were skeptical, but I said, but I'll be running a DAT machine in parallel with it, so, if things go awry. Well, the post-production person, trying to remember who it was, but in any case, Sound Deluxe was already on board. Sound Deluxe got excited about this whole idea. They were ready to do the transfers off the Diva, to MAG, and we were still transferring to MAG, so the editing department really didn't have to get involved. Picture editing didn't have to get involved in it. And what we had to do on that movie is they had another Diva in the transfer channel, and I would pull the hard drive out of my Diva in production and send the hard drive in, and they would put that in there and they would press play. And it was all done in real time. We weren't doing file transfers because file transfers wouldn't do us any good because they were transferring to MAG, which is a linear real-time format. So you got to play it out. If you got an hour's worth of material, it's going to take you an hour and 10 minutes or whatever to transfer it. But it all worked. And Sound Editorial on that picture was thrilled, first of all, with our production work, which was pretty good because, I generally do a pretty good job. But they were excited, too, that they could take the sound files that we'd made instead of conforming back to either one-to-one MAG transfers, which is the way they would do it a lot of times, or go back to the 1/4 inch and do a lot of reprints. They could go to the sound files and conform those. Because, as I said at the union meeting, this is the way we're going to be recording our production sound. It's not that Zaxcom invented file-based recording by any means, because sound editors and Sound Editorial has been using file-based recording for 10 years or more. But with computers and fixed installations and all, the big difference is this is a little tiny, robust, stable recorder that runs on a 12-volt battery that I have every bit of confidence I can take out into the desert and record production sound with it. So that was the sort of promise that file-based recording held out to all of us was that we would all be working on the same file. In other words, that the beginning, the first primary sound that is recorded would be in a file format, same as the same format that, you know, a broadcast wave file or whatever that you'd be dealing with in post. And it was pretty much a rocky road in the beginning because each production was very reluctant. I think at one point I got a picture to do at 20th Century Fox. Went in to talk to their post people, and I said, well, I'm going to be doing the production sound, and I actually use this new recorder. It's the Diva. It's a file-based recorder. And their eyes rolled back, and they said, you really just need to give us a DAT cassette the way we've always done it. And I said, you're talking to the wrong person. I said, because, you know, 8 or 9 years ago, I was sitting in this very same office trying to convince 20th Century Fox to allow me to use a DAT cassette. I said, you know, and then the other story that I've told a number of times is I was fortunate enough to go with my father in 1961 to a meeting at Columbia Pictures, actually, the United Artists, on a picture called The Best Man with Henry Fonda. Jack Solomon was the production sound mixer. He had been eyeing the Nagra 3, you know, quarter-inch, you know, Nagra. Wanted to use it on a major motion picture. Nagra had really only been used on, it was first used, even though in the recent Editors Guild magazine, they credit a picture called Geronimo as the first use of the Nagra 3, but actually the first use was on Lord of the Flies, Peter Brook's picture. Used the Nagra 3 in 1960, I think. Certainly it hadn't proven itself. It was used after that on some documentaries because it was a portable recorder and all this sort of stuff. But feature films, no way. So I went to this meeting that they had at Columbia where all the engineers crowded around. Lorne Ryder had brought the Nagra 3. They were, Ryder Sound was going to be the distributor of the Nagra. Set the recorder down there, and somebody else from Nagra was there to tell everyone about the machine. They all looked at it and they listened to it and they said, well, it's a really nice machine. I'm sure it'll be very useful, possibly in some documentaries and certainly as a reporter's recorder and all that. But it will never be used to record film sound because film sound has to be recorded on film. You know, up to that point, production sound was recorded primarily on Stansel-Hoffman magnetic film recorders. You recorded the sound on sprocketed film. That's the way we do it. So again, the engineers were proven wrong. The Nagra proved itself. But you know, it's a story that I've had to tell a number of times when people have been very resistant to any sort of change because we've had to go through. I mean, I would say that those are the three most significant changes in terms of production sound recording: use of the Nagra, use of DAT, and then file-based recording. I can't say that I had any hand in having the Nagra adopted because I wasn't, you know, 1960 when I was 12 years old. These transitions or this adopting of new technology came from the production sound mixer and primarily from me and a handful of other people in terms of file-based recording because we wanted to do it. There was tremendous advantages for us in production to do file-based recording if we could make it work. As I said again at this union meeting, what I love about this Diva that I held up, I said, is that we're going from a DAT machine with 1 million moving parts and wondering how it's ever going to work properly to a device that has one moving part, the hard drive, which is rated to spin reliably for 100,000 hours, you know, mean time before failure, and which is, you know, I'm fudging it a little bit because obviously there are all sorts of other failures. But I said, you know, the fact that we're going to a device that has one moving part is a tremendous advantage for us. And everyone that's ever had a tape jam or has ever had, you know, a DAT machine screw up or whatever can realize that that was a big advantage, and that was the big desire to go to something like this. And also the fact that we could easy and reliably record 4 tracks, which we couldn't do with the DAT machines. Even though there were some companies that had experimented with putting 4 tracks on DAT, and I'm sure that would be problematical. It would probably just be twice as bad as the 2 tracks on DAT. And I never got, I was very happy to just
Was that
say.
the PD4? Was that the?
No, that was still a 2-track machine. No, it was Stellavox that became the Stelladat. They tried a 4-track format on DAT, but it never caught on because the recorder itself had already failed miserably. So they didn't have any inroads into our business. But we could record 4 tracks, and also the other big, really wonderful thing was that we were making sound files. You have all the advantage of the fact you didn't have to worry about multiple copies of the same file, they'll be identical. And in answer to Courtney Gooden when he was talking about, what about confidence monitoring? We can't listen off the tape, when you're doing these file things and all. Well, what we had was checksum verification, okay? Which is much better than listening to whether we have the sound or not, because I found out that this whole confidence monitoring thing is a myth anyway. With the PD4 that I was using, the DAT machine on the Clint Eastwood picture, going back to that story, because finally Fostex gave me a new machine to use. I recorded on the DAT cassette on the new machine, sent it into transfer. They couldn't play that DAT cassette back on any of their machines in transfer. There was a slight misalignment, whatever like that. I had to send my machine in production in to make the transfers, okay? So much for confidence monitoring. I may have been listening off the tape, and during production, I thought I got a great recording. Nobody else could use it. Checksum verification, if you know anything about computers and all that, verifies that the data coming in is the data that was written to the disk or to the drive or whatever. And I don't have to hear it. As long as I don't get any error indication, as long as I don't get any problem, and the Diva was very good at letting you know that there was a problem, I was totally confident. I didn't have to hear it. And in fact, I will say that over the years, as there were more file-based recorders that came in and more people were doing it, there have been problems, and checksum verification doesn't always save you. And I'm sure you've had corrupted files, and I'm sure you've had all these things. But for the most part, in the beginning, it was smooth sailing for me, and everyone kind of loved it. I'm a real, I don't want to say Luddite because that's the wrong term, but I am so old school that even when I have my Diva 5.8, which is a 10-track machine, and I have 8 wireless microphones that work very well and all that, I still approach movies hopefully recording 1 track, 1 boom mic. And I have to tell you, for example, a big movie, Last Samurai, okay? I had my Diva, 4 tracks and all that. I would say 80% of that movie was done with 1 mic and 1 track. Obviously, a lot of people in post did a tremendous amount of wonderful work for the battle scenes and everything like that. But the production dialogue, 1 mic, 1 track. And even if I'm using multiple sources, I've got 4 wireless out there and 2 boom mics and all that, I still mix my brains out. I still mix as if I've only got that 1 track. Because I know that if I can't, and again, this goes back to what you were saying, that I really only have 1 shot at that kind of mix. But if I can't feel that I have a good shot at making 1 good mix from whatever sources I've decided to use to cover a scene, then you guys are going to have trouble, or the people in re-recording when they have to mix, because ultimately they have to mix it to 1 track also. The dialogue is still generally coming out of the center speaker, 1 track. It may be multiple tracks to make it happen, but you have to be able to mix all these sources to make sense. So I try and do that. And fortunately, the movies that I'm on, I'm pretty successful at making what's now just called like the mix track in a very sort of denigrating fashion, actually, because people are out there now where there's no way they're going to get a credible mix on that 1 track, because you're shooting 4 cameras, you're shooting, everyone's wearing wireless mics, half of them are giving you tremendous trouble because that's not where the microphone should be, but it's the only place the microphone can be. So you can still try and make a mix that works, but you really won't be successful for the most part. You're going to have to rely on people in post, breaking out all those tracks, everything's on ISOs and all that, going in there, cleaning everything up, trying to figure out, well, I can't clean up this track, but it happens to be the guy standing next to him. His track works pretty good, so I'll use that track. You know, things that you know, the production sound mixer, maybe by take 4, if there is a take 4, just beginning to figure out how I might be able to make that work in the mix, and then they're on to something else, and you know. I have always tried to separate the equipment and the technology and all that from what I do as a professional sound mixer, production sound mixer, because I feel that it's specifically an American thing also, is this desire to somehow believe that I can get a piece of equipment that's going to make everything good. I don't have to hire you or you to make it good. I can get that piece of equipment. I can solve the problem with a piece of equipment. Because first of all, the piece of equipment is going to talk back to me. It costs less. Even if it costs more, they don't care. There's this fascination with equipment and technology solving our problems, and it carries over all the way into, you know, waging war in Iraq. You know, I mean, so I've tried to keep these things separate. So I certainly would accept a job if somebody from the studio called and said, we'd like to get Jeff because he really knows what he's doing with all this file-based stuff, because he's one of the few people that actually has done it and all that. I certainly would take the job, but I would much rather get the job from a director or a producer that says, you got to get Jeff Wexler because he just did a fabulous job on the last movie. And we don't care what he was using. Because as I've said before, a good conversation with the director in the morning will ensure a better soundtrack than any piece of equipment that I can show up with. And I'm still totally fascinated by the gear and the tools and all that, and I get totally into that, and I love getting new equipment, and I love pioneering and doing all that stuff. But I try and keep the appropriate balance between those two things, because the technology and the equipment and all that is going to change, you know, and now it's changing rapidly all the time, that I don't want to tie my career and my abilities and what I would like to think are my creative choices in production to be superseded by, you know, some piece of gear or something. I mean, I actually had a production manager. I'd done 2 movies for this person. They called me for a film, and they said, you know, it's very low budget. I don't think it's something you'd be interested in. You know, we really can't afford you and all that. But I'd love to know, can I get an equipment list from you, what you were using on the you know, so, you know, I figured out what they're doing. They wanted to get my equipment list, you know, what I used in production on their last movie, where they had a brilliant soundtrack. I did a really good job, you know, everyone was happy, and give that to somebody else that they were going to hire who doesn't have the experience. You know, get Jeff's equipment. You'll do a good job. You know, you'll do a job just like Jeff. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous, but they'll try anything. You also have to educate the people that are hiring you, because sometimes they're hiring you just because, you know, you'll work for the right amount of money, or you did a good job maybe on the last movie, whatever, but they don't really understand what we do in production. I mean, for example, on The Black Marble, which is a picture that Joe Wambaugh was the producer on it, and he had produced one other movie, Onion Field, which he was originally a writer and an ex-cop. We showed up at a location, incredibly noisy, and it was a cemetery scene, very tender scene, guys kneeling down to the gravestone. You know, it was right at the intersection. We were in El Segundo or something. I mean, it was just horrendous traffic. He put on the headphones. You know, I gave him a set of headphones to listen to a rehearsal. Took the headphones off, and he went, "This is horrible." He said, "I can hardly hear them talking. What are you going to do about all the traffic noise?" I said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "You know, we'll get rid of the traffic noise." And he was still like totally troubled. He wouldn't even put the headphones back on, and he was just sort of pacing around and all. So we go to Daly's the next day. He listens to stuff on the screen, comes over to me. He says, "It was great." He said, "I heard every word." He said, "It was amazing. how did you get rid of the traffic noise? And I said, we stopped the traffic. And he said, well, there's like a filter, or, and he started going like this, like a long microphone, you know. He said, were you able to, and I said, no, we stopped the traffic. And he looked at me and he said, you mean like with the police? And, you know, and this is an ex-cop talk. And I said, yes, with the police, they stopped the traffic. And he kind of looked at me like, what a brilliant solution, you know. But the fact of the matter is, it was the only solution. You know, if you want to get rid of the traffic, you know. So somebody else heard this story, somebody else in the production, and they said, you know, Joe Wambaugh kept doing, you know, showing the long microphone. He said on the last movie they were doing, he said we had a similar situation, a lot of traffic noise and all, and you know, the sound mixer, you know, the boom operator was using this big long microphone, and you know, saying everything's going to be fine and all. And he said, and we got into mixing the movie, and you know, we didn't hear as much traffic as there was there, but you know, the voices sounded terrible. He said, you know, we ended up having to loop the scene anyway, not because there was too much traffic, but our actress just didn't sound like the same person that was in the scene before that we shot on stage, because it was the wrong way to solve the problem. For all multi-track recording, I adopted what seemed to make the most sense at the time, because there weren't that many people doing any multi-track recording, was take track one and just treat it like my mono Nagra. That's it. You know, if I have one mic out there, one mic, it's going to that track and I'm mixing it. See, that's the other thing about mixing. When you're a production sound mixer, we're not always mixing stuff. You know, if you got one microphone out there, but we're still working as production sound mixers because we're making all these other decisions. The primary decision being, what are we recording? If I'm recording your close-up, I'm not mixing anything, but what I've done as a production sound mixer is I've said, okay, we're doing your close-up now. We don't need to run the 45 extras that were in the background on that other shot because we want to get this close-up clean. To me, that's mixing, but it's like physical mixing. It's getting control over what we record so that all of you guys will be able to put the scene together. When we're on your close-up, we can take the track from that background that was filing through there in their high heels and whatever, and mix it in, but mix it in where you want it to be on your close-up. Instead of shooting, and I'll answer the rest of your question in a second, instead of when we're shooting your close-up, why don't we also get the B camera and shoot all these people going by, you know, as a cutaway, you know? Well, if you got all those people going by and they're standing right over there, it's going to screw up the close-up. I have to go to the director or to the cameraman and say, you know, that's a really bad idea. Why? You know, this camera's not seeing that guy. I said, I know, but the microphone is hearing all those people, you know, so, and you have to talk them out of it, you know, so it's, because I got the other camera and the camera crew's been sitting around all day. Let's get them to shoot something, you know. So with the Diva, I had 4 tracks, but still primarily, I'd be mixing if I was doing 2 boom mics. I'd mix them, you know, be using the second boom just for the shot when she comes through the door and I have to get that line there and the first boom operator can't get there, so I'll use that mic, or the plant that's right there for the one line that you have when you look down at the stool, and I'll mix all those things so they're right for whatever the camera's seeing for that shot. The advantage of multitrack is that I can take each one of those sources and I can put it pre-fader, not mixed by me, on its own track, and someone else can go back and they can remix the whole scene with the same sources that were put down on their own tracks. That's the beauty of multitrack. The good actors, I mean, it's been proven to me time and time again when I've worked with the real veteran actors. Gregory Peck on Other People's Money, okay? He would apologize to people if he didn't put it all together in a scene, if he missed his mark. He'd cut the camera. He'd say, let me do it again, you know, or if he didn't speak properly. And it wasn't just like blowing a line, it was like speaking properly, you know. If it was the scene where he's supposed to be talking to someone who's, you know, 10 feet away and he's forgotten to bring his voice up, he'll apologize. He'll apologize to me. He'll apologize to the director. He said, you know, I need to be a little bit more forceful. They would never hear me, you know. Well, these are things which, as a production sound mixer, it's gold, because what they're doing is they're giving me something to record that makes sense and it works for the scene. And if, as a production sound mixer, I like to think of myself as a filmmaker. And even though everybody else on the production, including a lot of times the director, think that, well, you're the sound mixer. I don't want to hear from you unless we're having a sound problem. But I don't, I'll work with those directors, but the directors I like to work with are the directors that know that there's a tremendous value, not only in all the things I'm trying to do in the production soundtrack, but they value my opinion, because they know that I'm completely on board with them to make a good movie, and I'm the only person, me and the two guys working with me, and it may actually be a woman, so I shouldn't say guys, the 3-person sound crew, we're the only people here that are responsible for the sound in your movie right now. Well, first of all, with mechanical sounds and stuff, like eating scenes are terrible and all sort of stuff. It's the reason for dealing with that is obvious probably to most of you, but it's not obvious to everyone. But it's because you need to adhere to one of the primary rules of sound recording, in my mind, which is it is much easier to add things than it is to take things away. When you have things that you don't want that are in there, even if they're not necessarily married to anything at all, it's time consuming, okay? And it's not nice time, because you're basically trying to repair something. So when people say, well, why aren't you recording all those footsteps? Or why aren't you recording all these things? Or why are you putting moleskin on the bottom of those plates when they set them down? It doesn't bother me. I hear the plates set down. I said, it will bother you later, and it will bother your sound editor later. Because if you really want the sound of that plate going down, it can be done. It can be done in Foley. If you really like that plate, I'll record it while down. You can have your editor lay it in at dailies, whatever. I said, but I can tell you professionally and responsibly, I don't want to hear that plate going down on their line. Well, he's not setting it down on his line. I said, well, he did on take 2, but take 3 he might. So we still go in there and try and do all those things. And as far as dealing with the actors, that's a different relationship on every movie, depending on, there's some directors that tell you right up front, I don't want you talking to the actors about anything, you can say good morning to them, that's it, okay? And you have to respect that. They're directing, you're working for the director. Other directors may say, if you're having trouble, whatever someone's, you just go ahead and talk to Dean. He's a good guy. He doesn't mind. You don't have to bother me with that. You just go right to the guy and tell him. And if he is really a good guy and an actor, he'll say, God, I'm sorry I set that plate down. Can you put something on the bottom, so I can, and I'll, and then my, utility guy will be, should I actually already have been in there because we're doing a food scene or an eating scene, he should have done all the plates and everything, so we don't have the problem and we don't even have to talk to the actor. But it is all in deference to that rule of being able to add things and not being able to take things away. And the relationships are so important because, and the relationships with the rest of the crew. In other words, every other department can have such a serious effect on the sound recording. If you've got a prop person who says, I don't want you putting anything on that plate. I like the way the plate looks. The camera might see that. I don't want you putting anything. Then you have to have a relationship with the prop person. Otherwise, you can't put anything on that plate. There are serious things that happen with the electric department, with the gaffer, with where they put the generator, where they put the ballast for the lights. They'd like to put them right on the set. Short feeder cable, great. Can't hear yourself think with them. Making. But the good departments, they'll come to me in the morning. The gaffer will come to me, or if I'm fortunate enough to be on location scouts, which I used to be on all the time. They don't do it as much anymore. Good gaffer, particularly somebody I've worked with before, said, I've got a little bit of a problem with this location. I really wanted to put the generator 500 feet away behind that building, but they're not giving me clearance, so it's actually going to have to be in the alley here. It's going to be a little bit closer, but I've got construction building a little wall, and a done deal. We're not going to have any generator problems, I didn't even have to go to anybody. They came to me. But that's also a function of the fact that I've had good relationships with these people working. We may have done 5 or 6 movies together, and they know that we're going to make a great movie. It's going to be well lit, it's going to look great, it's going to sound great, and we're going to serve the director and we're going to serve the project, and we're all in the same movie, So if he were like, a real a-hole gaffer and said, I got to put the generator there, deal with it. Can't you just put a mic on him? Then that's not a good relationship, but that happens, and we may end up having to put a mic on them when we don't want to. A nice open mic here would be great, but it's going to buy too much generator, so we have to get a little bit more isolation by putting a mic on them. The overall scene is not going to sound as good, but we'll get through it.